climate change may not unfold in this way. There might be sudden breakpoints, tipping points, and it is these that have the scientists and global leaders really worried. The weather systems that regulate and distribute temperature are dependent on currents and winds. The mightiest of these is the Great Ocean Current, taking warm water from the Pacific and bringing it up to the colder parts of Europe and America. If there was no current, then you'd need to introduce a third more sunlight to sustain Europe's temperature. The upper part is what we call the Gulf Stream. The engine room of this current is here. By the time the current gets to this point, it has released a lot of its heat, and it is now dense and heavy with salt. This weight causes the current to sink. This falling motion pulls the water behind it. Two things could dilute this current. The first is a lot of rain, but it would take a huge amount. And the second is a meltwater pulse, the sudden release of fresh water from rapidly melting snow and ice. There is still a lot of ice sitting right next to this critical and vulnerable spot. There is some evidence this is happening, and the IPCC predicts a slowing by the end of this century. This is often referred to as the lungs of the Earth, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. On the underside of every leaf, there are stomata, which suck in carbon dioxide and sigh out oxygen and water vapor. In places like the Amazon, so much vapor is released that it creates just about all its own rainfall. If there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, by midway through the day, the leaves get full and close down, which means less rain, which means the canopy will break down. In rainforests, there's a lot of carbon dioxide trapped in the soil. When directly exposed to the sunlight, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, leapfrogging from door 4 to door 6. The worst case nightmare scenario is that there could be a number of dry years followed by a devastating forest fire, which would release all the captured carbon dioxide in the trees and take the Amazon off the map as a carbon sink. In the permanently frozen ground is an estimated 5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide locked in by the ice. However, the ice is melting. There's been a 7% decrease in the size of permafrost since 1900, and since 1980 the whole area has warmed by 3 degrees and decreased in depth by 1/3 of a metre. The result is vast boglands that produce methane, 60 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. This would jump us directly to door 6 in a relatively short period of time. On the ocean floor, about 400 metres below the surface, is another store of methane. It would take a considerable amount of warming, but it is possible that a big increase in sea temperature could bring the methane to the surface and add another several hundred parts per million of greenhouse gases. The real problem is that if one nightmare scenario happened, it might switch on another and another and another. So what can we do? Well, we've created the problem and we can also be the solution. The economist Sir Nicholas Stern, the advisor to the UK government on global climate change, puts it like this. It is no longer possible to prevent the climate change that will take place over the next 2 to 3 decades, but it is still possible to protect our societies and economies from its impacts. Nicholas Stern has calculated that if we spend 1% of global gross domestic product now, we can avoid the worst impacts of climate change. If not, we may have to spend between 5 and 20% of global GDP to counterbalance its most adverse effects. If we were spending 20% on climate change recovery programs, there'd be little left over for schools, hospitals, and the other infrastructure we take for granted. Even at 5% of GDP, we would be struggling to provide essential services. We're headed towards a level of greenhouse gas emissions and their consequences that are going to make life very difficult for all of us. We need to do more. Organisations can do their part. They need to take the challenge of climate change head on. They need measurable targets supported by real initiatives. Organisations need to see climate change as an opportunity and not just a risk to their business. Individually, we can all make a difference. We should not underestimate the power we can exert in our homes and through our habits. Without spending any money at all, we can all do a lot to combat the effects of climate change.